Welcome to one of the most shocking cases ever written down in the history of Louisiana. Before we start, invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. Want to know which places and what times of day or night these true stories reach? My name is Elias, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was barely 19 years old. My brother Jonah was 17, and we had spent our entire lives on the Beaumont plantation in the heart of Louisiana's sugar country. The year was 1841, and the world we knew was built on blood, sweat, and the crack of master Beaumont's whip. I remember that night like it was yesterday, the night everything changed. The night we became something else entirely. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of magnolia blossoms, but underneath it all was the metallic scent of fear that seemed to permanently hang over our quarters. Jonah and I had been working the field since dawn, our backs aching from cutting sugar cane under the merciless Louisiana sun. Master Beaumont had been in one of his moods all week, the kind that meant someone was going to suffer. We'd learned to read the signs, the way he'd grip his riding crop a little tighter, the way his pale blue eyes would scan the fields, looking for the slightest excuse to unleash his fury. That evening, as the sun painted the sky blood red, we heard the screaming. It was coming from the big house, and it wasn't the usual sounds of punishment we'd grown accustomed to. This was different, raw, desperate, the kind of sound that cuts through your soul and stays there forever. Jonah grabbed my arm, his dark eyes wide with terror. "Elias, we got to see." "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the evening chorus of crickets and bullfrogs from the nearby swamp. I wanted to tell him no. Wanted to drag him back to our cabin and pretend we hadn't heard anything. But something in his voice, something in the way the screaming seemed to echo off the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oak trees, made me nod. We crept through the shadows, staying low as we approached the main house. The white columns gleamed in the moonlight like bones, and the windows glowed with warm yellow light that seemed obscene, given what we were hearing. Through the parlor window we saw her, Sarah, a girl barely 16 who worked in the kitchen. She was tied to a chair, her brown skin glistening with sweat and blood. Master Beaumont stood over her with a branding iron, its tip glowing red hot in the firelight. "You thought you could steal from me?" Beaumont's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You thought I wouldn't notice a few missing biscuits?" Sarah's sobs filled the room as he pressed the iron against her shoulder. The smell of burning flesh drifted through the open window, and I felt Jonah's body go rigid beside me. But it wasn't just the branding that broke something inside us that night. It was what came next. Beaumont's son, Charles, a boy our age with soft hands and cruel eyes, stepped forward with a knife. "Father, let me finish this lesson," he said, his voice eager, excited. "What they did to Sarah in that room, I can't bring myself to describe it fully even now, but I watched my brother's face change as we witnessed it. Something died in his eyes that night, and something else was born, something dark and hungry. When it was over, when Sarah's screams had finally stopped, Jonah turned to me with tears streaming down his face. But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of rage, so pure, so concentrated that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "We're leaving tonight," he whispered, his voice steady, despite the tears. "And someday, Elias, someday they're going to pay for what they did to her." I nodded, knowing there was no going back. We couldn't unsee what we'd witnessed. Couldn't unfeel the way our hearts had hardened in our chests like cooling iron. We slipped back to our cabin, moving like ghosts through the slave quarters. Most of our people were asleep, exhausted from another day of back-breaking labor. A few sat on their porches, smoking pipes and speaking in hushed tones about the screaming they'd heard. Old Moses, who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone, caught my eye as we passed. He was sitting on his steps, whittling a piece of wood with hands that had seen 70 years of bondage. "You boys got that? Look," he said quietly, not lifting his eyes from his carving. "That look that says you're about to do something that can't be undone." Jonah stopped walking. "What would you do, Moses? If you were young again, what would you do?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. The only sound the scraping of his knife against the wood. Finally, he looked up at us with eyes that held decades of pain and wisdom. "I'd remember that once you cross certain lines, boy, there ain't no coming back. The swamp out there, it changes people. Makes them into things they never thought they could be." He paused, studying our faces in the moonlight. "But sometimes that's the only way to survive." We gathered what little we had. A few pieces of bread, a rusty knife Jonah had hidden under his mattress, and the clothes on our backs. As we prepared to leave, I caught sight of myself in the broken mirror hanging on our cabin wall. I looked like any other slave, thin from poor food, scarred from years of punishment, eyes that had learned to look down and never meet a white man's gaze directly. But something was different now. There was a hardness there that hadn't existed that morning, a coldness that seemed to reflect the moonlight streaming through our window. "You ready for this?" Jonah asked, shouldering our meager pack. I thought about Sarah, about the way she'd looked at us through the window in those final moments, not with hope for rescue, but with a desperate plea for someone to remember her, to make sure her death meant something. "Yeah," said, and meant it. "I'm ready." We slipped out into the night, leaving behind the only world we'd ever known. The Louisiana swamp stretched out before us like a dark ocean filled with dangers we couldn't imagine. But as we walked toward the Trian, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A sense of purpose that burned in my chest like a flame. Behind us, the plantation slept peacefully, unaware that 2 of its slaves had just transformed into something else entirely. The Spanish moss whispered secrets in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out like a warning. We were no longer Elias and Jonah, the obedient slaves who kept their heads down and their mouths shut. We were something new, something dangerous. And as we disappeared into the swamp that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking toward a destiny written in blood. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was the glow from the big house windows, still warm and inviting. From the outside, still hiding the horrors within. But we would remember. We would carry Sarah's screams with us into whatever we were about to become. And someday, somehow, we would make them pay. 3 days in the Louisiana swamp had taught us things no plantation slave should ever have to learn. How to move silently through knee-deep water without disturbing the alligators. How to tell which berries would fill your belly and which would kill you. How to sleep with one eye open while mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds drained what little blood we had left. But most importantly, we learned that freedom came with it. Price we hadn't expected to pay. Jonah and I had been following what looked like an old hunting trail deeper into the bayou, hoping to find other runaways or maybe a settlement of free blacks we'd heard whispered about in the quarters. The canopy above us was so thick that even at midday we moved through a green twilight that played tricks on your eyes and made every shadow look like a threat. My brother had changed since that night we fled. The boy who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and sneak me extra cornbread when I was sick had been replaced by someone harder, more focused. His eyes constantly scanned our surroundings, and his hand never strayed far from the rusty knife we'd brought with us. "You hear that?" Jonah whispered, grabbing my arm. I stopped walking and listened. The constant symphony of the swamp, the croaking frogs, buzzing insects, and distant splash of something large moving through the water. I could hear voices, human voices getting closer. We dropped low, crawling behind a massive cypress tree whose roots created a natural hiding place. Through the Spanish moss hanging like curtains around us, I could see them approaching. 4 white men on horseback, moving slowly along the trail we'd been following. I recognized the leader immediately, Sergeant Pike, the man Master Beaumont hired when he needed someone found and brought back. Pike was a professional slave catcher, a man who made his living hunting human beings through these very swamps. He was tall and lean with pale skin that never seemed to tan despite years under the Louisiana sun, and eyes the color of dirty water. Trail goes cold here, Pike said, dismounting from his horse. But they can't have gone far. 2 field hands don't just disappear into thin air. One of his men, a younger fellow with nervous energy and a patchy beard, spat into the murky water. Maybe the gators got him. Save us the trouble. Pike shook his head. Beaumont wants them back alive. Says he's got special plans for the ones that killed his kitchen girl. My blood ran cold. I thought we had killed Sarah. Of course they did. 2 slaves disappear the same night a house servant dies, and white folks would naturally assume we were responsible. The truth that we'd witnessed her murder and fled in horror would never occur to them. What's the bounty again? Asked a third man, this one older with graying hair and hands that shook slightly as he held his rifle. $50 each alive. 25 if we have to bring them back dead. Pike's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the price of cotton or sugar. $50, more money than Jonah and I would see in a lifetime of slavery. And these men were willing to kill us for half that amount. I felt my brother tense beside me. And when I looked at his face, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was the same expression he'd worn while watching Sarah die. That cold, calculating look that said he was no longer thinking like prey. He was thinking like a predator. Pike and his men spread out, examining the muddy ground for tracks. They were good at their job, I had to admit. Within minutes, they'd found signs of our passage that I didn't even know we'd left behind. Here, Pike called out, kneeling beside a fallen log. Boot print, size about right for a field hand. And look here. Tried to cover their tracks, but missed this spot. They were maybe 30 feet away from our hiding place. Close enough that I could smell the tobacco on their breath and see the sweat stains on their shirts. Close enough to see the coiled whips hanging from their saddles and the iron shackles they brought to drag us back to hell. That's when Jonah made his move. I don't know how he managed to circle around behind them without making a sound. One moment he was beside me, the next he was rising from the water like some swamp spirit, a rusty knife gleaming in his hand. The nervous young man with the patchy beard never saw him coming. Jonah's blade found the soft spot just below his ear, sliding in smooth and quiet. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, then empty, and he toppled forward into the murky water without making a sound. Pike spun around at the splash, his rifle already coming up, but Jonah was already moving. He grabbed the dead man's pistol and fired before Pike could get a shot off. The bullet caught the sergeant in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the swamp. The older man with the shaking hands tried to run, but his horse reared up in panic, throwing him into the shallow water. He came up sputtering and screaming, "Don't kill me, please. I got children." That's when I realized I was moving. I don't remember making the decision to leave our hiding place. Don't remember picking up the fallen rifle or checking to make sure it was loaded. But suddenly, I was standing over the old man, looking down at him with something that felt like curiosity. "You got children?" asked my voice, sounding strange in my own ears. He nodded frantically, water streaming from his gray hair. "3 little ones." "Please, boy, I was just doing a job. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," I repeated, tasting the words. "Like hunting us through the swamp for money. Like planning to drag us back to be tortured and killed. Nothing personal about that." Behind me, I could hear Jonah dealing with Pike. The sergeant was wounded, but not dead, cursing and trying to crawl toward his horse. My brother's footsteps splashed through the water, steady and purposeful. "Please," the old man whispered. "I'll tell them I never found. I'll say you went north toward Mississippi. Just let me go back to my family." I looked into his eyes and saw genuine terror there. This man who made his living hunting other human beings was begging for his life, promising anything to see another day. And for the first time since we'd fled the plantation, I felt something other than fear or desperation. I felt power. The rifle was heavy in my hands, heavier than any tool I'd ever used in the fields. But when I pulled the trigger, it felt as natural as breathing. The old man's head snapped back and he fell into the water with a splash that sent ripples across the still surface. Blood began to spread around his body like spilled paint, dark red against the brown water. I stood there for a moment, watching the life drain out of him, and waited for the guilt to hit me. Waited for the horror, the regret, the crushing weight of what I'd just done. It never came. Instead, I felt satisfied, like I'd finally done something that mattered, something that balanced the scales just a tiny bit. This man would never hunt another runaway slave. His children would grow up without a father, yes, but how many children had he helped? Orphaned by dragging their parents back to plantations? Elias. Jonah's voice was calm, almost conversational. "You all right?" I turned to see him standing over Pike's body. The sergeant was very clearly dead. His throat opened in a precise line that spoke of experience I didn't know my brother possessed. "Yeah," I said and realized I meant it. "I'm all right." We stood there in the swamp, surrounded by dead men and their nervous horses, and I felt more alive than I ever had in my 19 years. The fear that had been my constant companion since childhood was gone, replaced by something harder and more useful. "We should take their supplies," Jonah said practically. "Guns, ammunition, food, and their horses if we can manage." I nodded, already moving toward the nearest saddlebag. Inside I found jerky, hardtack, a bottle of whiskey, and more ammunition than we could carry. Luxuries beyond anything we'd ever. As we gathered what we could use, I caught my brother watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "When you shot that old man, you didn't hesitate at all." I thought about that for a moment, replaying the scene in my He was right. There had been no internal struggle, no moment of doubt. When the time came to pull the trigger, I'd simply done it. Should I have? Jonah smiled then, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the night we fled. "No, brother. You shouldn't have. We're not the same people who left that plantation 3 days ago." He was right. The scared boys who had witnessed Sarah's murder and run into the night were gone. In their place stood something new, something that could look at 4 dead men and feel nothing but practical satisfaction. We mounted 2 of the horses and led the others deeper into the swamp, away from the trail where someone might eventually find the bodies. As we rode, I found myself thinking about the old man's children. wondering what they would be told about their father's death. But the thought didn't trouble me the way it should have. Instead, I found myself hoping they would learn a different trade, choose a different path than hunting human beings for money. Because if they didn't, if they followed in their father's footsteps, they might someday find themselves face to face with Jonah and me, and we were no longer the kind of people who showed mercy to those who showed us none. The swamp stretched out before us, vast and dark and full of possibilities. We had weapons now, supplies, and most importantly, we had discovered something about ourselves that changed everything. We were good at killing, and more disturbing than that, we enjoyed it. 2 weeks after our encounter with Pike and his men, Jonah and I had become ghosts in the Louisiana bayou. Through the swamp-like shadows, taking what we needed from isolated homesteads and leaving behind only whispered stories of two figures who appeared and vanished like smoke. But we weren't alone in these dark waters. The morning we found the settlement, I was tracking a wounded deer through a maze of cypress trees when I smelled wood smoke. Not the acrid smell of a house fire, but the warm, comforting scent of a cooking fire. Stomach, which had been gnawing at itself for days, despite our recent success hunting, immediately began to rumble. "Jonah," I whispered, and my brother materialized beside me like he'd been reading my thoughts. We'd both gotten better at moving silently through the swamp. Our feet had learned to find the solid spots in the muddy ground. Our eyes had adapted to reading the subtle signs that meant safety or danger. But more than that, we'd learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's movements like we shared the same mind. Through the Spanish moss and morning mist, we could see them. A collection of rough shelters built on stilts above the waterline, connected by wooden walkways that looked like they'd been constructed from salvaged materials. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and we could hear voices, men, women, and children talking in the relaxed way. That meant safety, community. Runaway slaves had to be. No white settlement would be hidden this deep in the swamp, and no free blacks would risk building permanent structures where they might be found. "How many you count?" Jonah asked, his voice barely audible. I studied the settlement more carefully. Maybe 20 adults, handful of children. They've got lookouts posted, but they're watching the main waterways, not expecting anyone to come through the deep swamp. My brother nodded. They're organized. Been here a while, looks. We watched for another hour, learning their routines, identifying their leaders. There was an older woman who seemed to be in charge of food distribution, a middle-aged man who directed work parties, and several younger men who carried themselves like soldiers. These weren't desperate refugees barely surviving in the wilderness. This was a functioning community. "We going to approach them?" I asked. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, studying the settlement with those calculating eyes that had become so familiar since our escape. "Question is, are they going to see us as allies or threats?" It was a fair concern. We weren't just runaway slaves anymore. We were armed, dangerous, and carrying supplies that would be hard to explain. The rifles we'd taken from Pike's men, the ammunition, the horses we'd hidden a while back. It all painted a picture of two men who had done things that might make even other runaways nervous. "Only one way to find out," I said, and started walking toward the settlement. The first lookout spotted us when we were still 50 yards. A young man, maybe 16, who'd been sitting in a tree with a fishing line in the water. He gave a low whistle that carried across the settlement like a bird call, and suddenly the relaxed atmosphere changed. People began moving with purpose. Children disappeared into shelters, and I counted at least 3 rifle barrels that appeared in windows and doorways. These folks had clearly dealt with unwelcome visitors before. "That's far enough," called out a voice from the largest shelter. A man stepped onto the walkway, and I immediately understood why the others looked to him for leadership. He was tall and broad-shouldered with skin dark as midnight and scars that spoke of years of hard labor and harder treatment. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, intelligent, weary, and absolutely fearless. This was a man who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. "I'm Samuel," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "And you two are either very brave or very stupid to walk into our home carrying those rifles." "Bit of both, probably," Jonah replied, and I was surprised to hear a hint of humor in his voice. "I'm Jonah. This is my brother, Elias. We're looking for somewhere to rest, maybe trade for some supplies." Samuel studied us for a long moment, his gaze taking in our weapons, our clothes, the way we held ourselves. "You boys got the look of men who've seen trouble recently. Question is, are you running from it or bringing it with you?" "Running from it," I said. "But we're not afraid to face it if it follows us here." That seemed to be the right answer. Samuel's expression softened slightly, and he gestured for us to approach. "Come on up, but keep those rifles pointed down. We've got children here, and nervous fingers on triggers don't mix well with little ones running around." As we walked across the wooden walkways, I got a better look at the settlement. It was more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. They had workshops, a smokehouse, even what looked like a small school where an elderly woman was teaching a group of children to read, using a battered Bible. "How long you been here?" Jonah asked Samuel as we reached the main platform. 3 years, give or take. Started with just me and my woman after we ran from a plantation up near Baton Rouge. Others found us or we found them. Now we got ourselves a proper community. A woman emerged from one of the larger shelters, and I immediately understood why Samuel had been willing to risk everything for freedom. She was beautiful in the way that transcended physical appearance. There was a strength in her bearing, an intelligence in her dark eyes that spoke of someone who had never truly been broken despite whatever horrors she'd endured. "This is my wife, Ruth," Samuel said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Ruth, these are the boys I was telling you about." Ruth studied us with the same careful attention her husband had shown, but her gaze lingered on our faces rather than our weapons. "You both look like you haven't had a proper meal in. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't caught or foraged?" My stomach answered for me with a loud rumble that made several of the children giggle. Ruth smiled and shook her head. "Come on, let's get some food in you before you fall over." As we sat around a fire, eating the best meal I'd had since leaving the plantation, fish stew with vegetables I didn't recognize but tasted like heaven, Samuel asked the questions I'd been expecting. "What plantation you boys run from?" "Beaumont's place down south of here," Jonah answered. 3 weeks ago." "Beaumont?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Heard stories about that place." "Heard. It's one of the worst in Louisiana. And that's saying something." "Stories are probably true," I said quietly. Ruth leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "What made you finally run?" "Most folks who escape from places like that, something specific pushes them over the edge." I looked at Jonah, wondering how much we should tell them. These people had welcomed us, fed us, shown us kindness we hadn't experienced in weeks. But they were also strangers, and the truth about what we'd become might change their hospitality into something else entirely. "We saw something we couldn't unsee," Jonah said finally. "Something that made staying impossible." Samuel nodded like he understood. "We all got our stories. Some folks are ready to share them. Others need more time. No judgment here." As the evening wore on, More people joined our circle around the fire. I heard stories of escape, of families torn apart and reunited, of the constant fear that lived in every runaway's heart. But I also heard laughter, saw children playing games in the firelight, witnessed the kind of community the plantation owners insisted was impossible for people like us. It was an older man named Moses. Not the same Moses from our plantation, but the name seemed common among our people who first mentioned the rumors. "You boys hear anything about the spirits in the eastern swamp?" he asked, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone people used when discussing things that might or might not be real. "Spirits?" I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. "Of them, they say, dark figures that hunt white men through the bayou. Some folks say they're the ghosts of slaves who died violent deaths, come back for revenge. Others say they're living men who've made a deal with something unholy." Ruth made a dismissive sound. "Moses, you're scaring the children with that nonsense." But Moses shook his head. "Nonsense, Ruth. I talked to a man just last week. Came through here heading north. Said he saw the aftermath of their work. 4 white men, all dead, left in the swamp like they were nothing more than gator bait." My blood went. 4 white men, Pike and his crew. "What else did this man say?" Jonah asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Said it looked professional. Clean kills, no wasted motion. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." Moses leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "But here's the strange part. They didn't take everything. Left behind things that desperate runaways would have grabbed. Like killing those men was more important than robbing them." Samuel was watching us now, his intelligent eyes noting our reactions. "You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire around. Conversations had stopped as people waited for our answer. I could feel the weight of their attention, the sudden tension that had replaced the earlier warmth. Jonah looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same calculation I'd been making. These people had shown us kindness, but they were also potential threats. If they decided we were too dangerous to harbor, we'd be back in the swamp alone. If they decided to turn us in for the bounty. "No," I said finally. "We don't know anything about spirits or dead white men. We've been too busy trying to survive to worry about ghost stories." Moses studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Of course not. Curious is all. Strange times we're living in when the swamp itself seems to be fighting back against the people who've been hunting us." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed that Samuel and Ruth exchanged glances, and several of the other adults seemed to be watching us more carefully than before. We'd passed their initial test, but we hadn't convinced everyone. Later that night, as Jonah and I lay in the small shelter they'd given us, my brother whispered, "They suspect." "Yeah," I agreed. "Question is, what are they going to do about it?" Samuel's smart. He knows we're not telling the whole truth, but he also knows we're not a threat to his people. As long as we don't bring trouble here, I think we're safe. I hoped he was right. These people had built something beautiful in the middle of hell. The place where families could exist without fear. Where children could learn to read and play games by firelight. The last thing I wanted was to destroy that. But as I drifted off to sleep, I could hear Moses's words echoing in my mind. 2 spirits that hunt white men through the bayou. We weren't spirits. We were just 2 men who had discovered they were very good at killing people who deserved to die. But if that's what the stories needed us to be, if that's what gave hope to people like Samuel and Ruth and their community, then maybe being ghosts wasn't such a bad thing. The swamp whispered around us, full of secrets and shadows. And somewhere in those whispers, our legend was growing. Word traveled fast. through the Louisiana bayou, carried by trappers and traders, whispered in slave quarters and shouted in taverns. By the time Jonah and I had spent a week with Samuel's community, the stories about us had taken on a life of their own. We weren't just two runaway slaves anymore. We were the swamp devils, the shadow brothers, the dark angels of the bayou. Every dead white man found in the wetlands was attributed to us. Every mysterious disappearance became part of our legend. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than the story suggested. We had killed exactly 6 men since our escape. Pike and his 3 companions, plus 2 bounty hunters who'd gotten too close to Samuel's settlement for comfort. But according to the rumors, we were responsible for dozens of deaths. Supernatural beings who could appear and disappear at will, who could kill with a touch and vanish into the mist. I was mending a fishing net when Samuel approached me on the morning everything changed. His face was grim and he carried himself with the tension of a man bearing bad news. Elias, I need to talk to you and your brother privately. I found Jonah helping to repair one of the walkways, his hands steady as he worked with tools that would have been forbidden to him on the plantation. He looked up at Samuel's tone and immediately set down his hammer. We followed Samuel to a small platform at the edge of the settlement, far enough from the main area that we couldn't be overheard. Ruth was waiting for us there along with 2 other men I recognized as the settlement scouts. We got a problem, Samuel said without preamble. Big one. One of the scouts, a wiry man named Thomas, stepped forward. There's an army coming through the swamp. Not just bounty hunters or local militia. This is organized, well-equipped, and they're asking questions about 2 specific runaway slaves. My stomach dropped. How many men? 30, maybe 40, led by a man calling himself Colonel Briggs. They got dogs, boats, enough supplies for a long hunt. Thomas paused, studying our faces. They also got detailed descriptions of you boys. Someone who knew you well gave them information. Jonah's jaw tightened. Beaumont has to be. I agreed. But why now? Why send an army after 2 field hands? Ruth spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. Because you're not just 2 field hands anymore, are you? You're symbols. Every slave in Louisiana has heard the stories about the brothers who fight back, who make the white folks afraid to venture into the swamp alone. Samuel nodded. You've become something bigger than yourselves, and that scares them more than any individual escape ever could. Understood now. It wasn't about recovering stolen property or even about justice for the men we'd killed. It was about fear. The fear that other slaves might look at our example and decide they didn't have to accept their fate. Quietly. What do you want us to do? Jonah asked. Leave, Samuel said bluntly. Tonight before they get close enough to find this place. We can give you supplies, point you toward other settlements further north, but if you stay here, you'll bring that army down on all of us. It was the right decision, the only decision that made. These people had families, children, a life they'd built from nothing. We had no right to endanger that for our own safety. We understand, I said. We'll be gone before dawn. But Thomas shook his head. Might be too late for that. My partner, Jake, is still out there keeping an eye on them. If he's right about their route, they'll be here by tomorrow evening. Then we leave now, Jonah said, already standing. Right now before he was interrupted by a low whistle from the settlement's perimeter, the signal for immediate danger. We all turned to see Jake emerging from the swamp, moving faster than I'd ever seen a man move through knee-deep water. His face was pale with exhaustion and fear, and when he reached our platform, he was breathing so hard he could barely speak. They're here, he gasped. Half a mile out, moving fast. They got the settlement surrounded. Samuel cursed. Under his breath. How? You said they were still hours away. They split up. Sent advance teams around to cut off escape routes while the main force approached from the south. This Briggs. He knows what he's doing. Through the trees I could hear them now. Some of men moving through water, the occasional bark of a tracking dog, voices calling out orders in the distance. They were being quiet, but 40 men couldn't move through a swamp in complete silence. Options? Samuel asked. His voice steady despite the circumstances. Thomas was already checking his rifle. Fight or surrender. Those are the only choices they're giving us. We don't fight, Ruth said firmly. We got children here, Samuel. We can't risk. They're not here for the children, Jonah interrupted. His voice cold. They're here for us. And men like Briggs don't leave witnesses. He was right and we all knew it. A military expedition this size, this well-organized, wasn't planning to take prisoners and sort things out later. They were here to make an example, to send a message that would echo through every slave quarter in the South. There's another option, I said, an idea, forming in my mind. We give them what they came for. Samuel looked at me sharply. You mean surrender? I mean we give them a hunt. Draw them away from here. Lead them deeper into the swamp where they can't use their numbers effectively. I looked at Jonah, seeing understanding dawn in his eyes. We've gotten good at killing men in small groups. Time to see how we do against an army. The suicide. Ruth protested. 2 men against 40. You'll be slaughtered. Jonah smiled. And there was something in that expression that made even Samuel take a step back. Maybe, but we won't go. Quietly. And every man we take with us is one less hunting other runaways. The sound of approaching voices was getting closer. We had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the settlement. Samuel, I said urgently, there's a channel about 200 yards north of here, runs deep into the swamp. Take your people and follow it as far as you can. Don't stop until you're sure you're clear. What about you? We're going to buy you time. Make enough noise to draw their attention. Then lead them on a chase they'll never forget. Samuel gripped my shoulder. You don't have to do this. We can all run. Find somewhere else to build. No, Jonah said firmly. We're tired of running, tired of hiding. Time to remind these bastards why they should be afraid of the dark. Ruth stepped forward and pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch that felt heavy with coins. For supplies, if you make it out of this. When we make it out, I corrected, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The first shout came from the settlement's edge. Someone had spotted the shelters. We were out of time. Go, I told Samuel. Get your people to safety, and if anyone asks what happened here, tell them the swamp devils kept their word. Samuel nodded once, then turned and began issuing quiet orders to his people. Within moments, the settlement was in motion. Families gathering essential supplies, children being hushed and carried. The entire community preparing to vanish into the bayou like they'd never existed. Jonah and I moved in the opposite direction toward the sounds of the approaching army. We had our rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. You ready for this? My brother asked as we took position behind a massive cypress tree. I thought about Samuel's community, about the children learning to read by firelight, about Ruth's gentle hands and Moses' stories. Thought about Sarah dying alone in that plantation house while monsters wearing human faces tortured her for sport. Yeah, I said, checking my rifle one last time. I'm ready. The first soldier appeared through the Spanish moss, moving cautiously but confidently. He was young, maybe 20, with the soft look of someone who'd never faced real danger. Behind him, I could see others spreading out in a professional search pattern. I took aim and waited for Jonah's signal. When it came, a low bird call that sounded perfectly natural. Fired simultaneously. 2 soldiers dropped without a sound, their bodies splashing into the dark water. The rest of the patrol immediately took cover, shouting warnings and trying to locate our position. Contact, contact. 2 shooters northwest of the settlement. Perfect. We'd gotten their attention. Come on, Jonah. Whispered, already moving to our next position. Let's give them a hunt they'll never forget. As we melted into the swamp, I could hear Colonel Briggs's voice booming across the water, rallying his men and organizing a pursuit. He sounded confident, professional, like a man who'd done this many times before, but he'd never hunted the swamp devils. And before this day was over, he was going to learn why the bayou had become a place where white men feared to tread. Colonel Briggs was everything I'd expected and worse. When Jonah and I finally got a clear look at him 3 hours into our deadly game of cat and mouse, I understood why the plantation owners had sent him to hunt us down. He was a big man, built like a bull with graying hair and the kind of scars that spoke of real combat experience. But it was his eyes that marked him as truly dangerous, cold, calculating, and completely without mercy. This wasn't some local sheriff or bounty hunter looking to make easy money. This was a professional killer who turned hunting human beings into an art form, spread out in teams of 4. His voice carried clearly across the swamp as he directed his men. These boys are good, but they're not ghosts. They bleed like anyone else, and when we find them, I want them taken alive if possible. Alive if possible. That phrase sent a chill down my spine because it meant Briggs had plans for us that went beyond simple execution. Jonah and I had been leading them deeper into the bayou for hours, picking off stragglers and disappearing before they could organize a proper response. So far, we'd killed 8 of Briggs's men. Not the supernatural massacre the stories claimed we were capable of, but steady professional work that was clearly frustrating our pursuers. They're getting smarter, Jonah whispered as we watched another patrol move past our hiding spot, staying in larger groups, watching each other's backs. He was right. After losing the first few men, Briggs had adapted his tactics. No more lone scouts or 2-man teams. They moved in groups of 4 or 5 with overlapping fields of fire and constant communication. We need to change our approach, I said, studying the terrain around us. We'd led them to a section of the swamp I knew well, a maze of channels and small islands that would break up their formations and force them to split up again. What are you thinking? I pointed to a narrow channel that ran between 2 larger islands. Bottleneck. If we can get them to chase us through there, they'll have to come single file. We set up crossfire from both sides. Jonah's eyes lit up with understanding. They'll be trapped in the middle with nowhere to run. It was risky. If our timing was off, we'd be the ones trapped. But we'd been playing defense all day, and it was time to go on the attack. We spent the next hour setting up our ambush, positioning ourselves on opposite sides of the channel with clear lines of sight. I'd taken the north side, hidden behind a fallen log that provided both cover and a stable shooting platform. Jonah was across from me, invisible among the cypress roots and Spanish moss. Now we just needed to draw them in. I fired a single shot in the air, the sound echoing across the swamp like thunder. Within minutes, I could hear them coming, boots splashing through water, voices calling out coordinates, the organized sound of trained men responding to contact. The first group appeared at the mouth of the channel. 5 soldiers led by a sergeant with a magnificent mustache and the confident bearing of a career military man. They paused at the entrance, clearly recognizing the tactical disadvantage of the narrow passage. "Could be a trap, Sergeant," one of the younger soldiers said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. The sergeant studied the channel for a long moment, then shook his head. "Orders are to pursue and engage. Besides, it's just 2 runaway field hands. How dangerous can they be?" Famous last words. They entered the channel in single file, rifles ready, eyes scanning the banks for any sign of movement. I let them get halfway through before I gave Jonah the signal. Another bird call that sounded perfectly natural to anyone who didn't know better. We opened fire simultaneously, our shots echoing off the water like cannon blasts. The sergeant went down first, Jonah's bullet taking him center mass. I dropped the man behind him, then shifted to the third soldier as he tried to find cover that didn't exist. The remaining 2 men panicked, trying to retreat back the way they'd come, but they were trapped in the narrow channel with nowhere to run. It was over in less than 30 seconds. 5 more dead, 13 total since the hunt began. But as we prepared to move to our next position, heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of dogs barking getting closer. "Tracking hounds," Jonah said grimly. Briggs brought the whole package. This changed everything. We could hide from men, could use the swamp's natural camouflage to stay ahead of human pursuers. But dogs would follow our scent no matter how cleverly we tried to cover our tracks. "We need to reach deeper water," I said, already moving. "Get somewhere the dogs can't follow." But as we splashed through the swamp, I realized Briggs had anticipated this move too. The sound of boats was coming from multiple directions. Now they'd brought watercraft to cut off our escape routes. We were being herded, driven towards some predetermined killing ground where Briggs could use his superior numbers to end this hunt once and for all. There, Jonah pointed to a small island, maybe 100 yards ahead. High ground, good sight lines. "If we're going to make a stand, that's the place." I nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. This might be where our story ended, but if it was, we'd make sure it was a story worth telling. The island was maybe 50 feet across, covered with thick vegetation, and surrounded by open water on all sides. As defensive positions went, it was both perfect and terrible. We'd have clear fields of fire in every direction, but there was also nowhere to run if things went badly. We'd barely reached the center of the island when the first boats appeared. 3 of them carrying 4 men, each approaching from different angles to prevent us from concentrating our fire. "Elias, Jonah," Briggs's voice boomed across the water. "I know you can hear. This doesn't have to end with more bloodshed." "Like hell it doesn't," Jonah muttered, taking aim at the nearest boat. "You've killed 13 of my men," Briggs continued. 13 good soldiers who were just doing their job, but I'm prepared to offer you a deal." I almost laughed. "A deal? Like we were business partners negotiating a contract instead of predator and prey in a deadly game. Surrender now and I guarantee you'll live to see trial. Continue this resistance and I'll make sure your deaths are slow and painful." "Counteroffer," I shouted back. "Go to hell." Opened fire on the center boat, my bullet punching through the hole just above the waterline. The soldiers aboard began bailing frantically as their craft started taking on water. That was the signal for the real battle to begin. All 3 boats opened fire simultaneously, their rifles creating a deadly crossfire that turned the air around us into a storm of lead. Jonah and I pressed ourselves flat against the ground as bullets winded overhead and thudded into the trees around us. But we weren't helpless. Every time one of them paused to reload, we returned fire with devastating accuracy. I watched a soldier in the eastern boat spin and fall into the water, clutching his shoulder. Jonah's shot took out the man steering the western boat, sending it spinning in circles as the remaining crew tried to regain control. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the boats were sinking, and the third was retreating toward shore with half its crew dead or wounded. But our victory was short-lived. Even as we watched the surviving soldiers flee, I could hear more boats approaching and behind them the baying of hounds getting closer. "How many you count?" Jonah asked, reloading his rifle. With practiced efficiency, I did a quick mental calculation. We've killed maybe 20 of them now, but Briggs started with 40 and he might have reinforcements. 20 dead. We'd killed 20 trained soldiers in a single day, turning Briggs's confident hunt into a bloody nightmare. But we were running low on ammunition, and exhaustion was starting to take its toll. "You know what this means, don't you?" Jonah said quietly. I nodded. We'd reached the number the stories claimed. The 35 enemies we'd supposedly executed. For pleasure, except it hadn't been for pleasure at all. It had been for survival, for justice, for the simple right to exist as free men. But if the legend said 35, then 35 it would be. 15 more, I said, checking my remaining ammunition. Think we can manage it? Jonah smiled, and in that expression I saw the boy who used to laugh at my jokes and the man who'd learned to kill. Without hesitation. "Brother, I think we can manage anything." The next wave of boats appeared through the Spanish moss, and this time Briggs was with them. I could see him in the lead boat, his face grim with determination and something that might have been respect. He'd come to hunt 2 runaway slaves and found himself facing something else entirely. 2 men who refused to be victims, who turned the hunter into the hunted. As they approached our island fortress, I thought about Samuel's community, hopefully safe somewhere deeper in the swamp. I thought about Sarah and all the others who died without anyone to avenge them. I thought about the stories that would be told about this day and whether they'd remember us as monsters or heroes. Then I stopped thinking and started shooting because Jonah was right. We could manage anything. And before this day was over, Colonel Briggs was going to learn why the Swamp Devils had become the most feared names in all of Louisiana. The final battle was about to begin. The old woman appeared like a vision from the mist, walking across the water toward our island, as if the laws of nature didn't apply to her. Jonah and I had been preparing for what we thought would be our final battle when she emerged from the Spanish moss, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Colonel Briggs and his remaining men stopped their advance, clearly as stunned as we were. You don't expect to see an elderly black woman strolling through a war zone like she's taking an evening walk. Mama Lavo, one of Briggs's soldiers, whispered, and I heard genuine fear in his voice. I'd heard the name before, whispered in slave quarters, and spoken with reverence by those who practiced the old Marie Lavo, the voodoo queen of New Orleans. Though this woman looked older than the story suggested, she was small and bent with age. Her dark skin weathered like old leather, but her eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. "Colonel Briggs," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the water despite its softness. "You've come a long way to hunt 2 boys who never asked for anything but freedom." Briggs recovered his composure quickly, though I noticed his hand stayed near his pistol. "This is military business, old woman. Suggest you move along before you get hurt." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Hurt, child? I was walking these swamps before your grandfather was born. The bayou doesn't hurt me. It protects me." As if to prove her point, an enormous alligator surfaced near her feet, its prehistoric eyes studying Briggs's boats with what looked like intelligent malice. The soldiers shifted nervously, suddenly aware that they were surrounded by more than just water and trees. Now then, Mama Lavo continued, stepping onto our island with impossible grace. I think it's time these boys learned the truth about themselves. And you, Colonel, might want to hear this story too. She looked at Jonah and me with those ancient eyes, and I felt like she was seeing straight through to our souls. You boys been wondering why killing comes so easy to you, haven't you? Why you feel that hunger for violence, that satisfaction when you watch the life leave your enemy's eyes? I wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat. She was right. There was something inside us that enjoyed the killing. Something that went beyond simple survival or justice. Sit, she commanded, and despite everything, the approaching soldiers, the loaded rifles, the imminent battle, we found ourselves obeying. Your mama, she began settling herself on a fallen log like she was preparing to tell a bedtime story. Was a beautiful woman named Celeste. Worked in the big house on the Beaumont plantation. Caught the master's eye when she was barely 16. My blood went cold. Our mother had died when we were infants. That's what we'd always been told. Died of fever, they said, nothing more to know. Celeste was special, Mama Lavo continued. Had the sight, could see things others couldn't. And she saw what Master Beaumont really was. Not just a cruel man, but something darker, something that fed on pain and suffering like other men feed on bread. Jonah leaned forward, his rifle forgotten. What are you saying? I'm saying Mama made a deal, boys. A deal with powers older than this country, older than the white man's God. She traded her life, her soul, to give you two something that could fight back against the darkness she saw coming. The old woman's eyes seemed to glow in the fading light. She gave you the hunger, the skill, the ability to kill without hesitation. Made you into weapons that could cut through evil like a knife through butter. But every gift has a price. Price? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. The hunger don't stop with the guilty child. It grows, spreads once more. Your mama thought she could control it. Thought she could make it only target those who deserve death. But darkness is darkness, and it always wants to spread. I thought about the satisfaction I'd felt killing Pike's men, the way my heart had raced during the ambush in the channel. She was right. There was something inside us that enjoyed the violence, that craved it like an addiction. So, what are we? Jonah asked quietly. Monsters? Mama Lavo smiled sadly. You're what your mama made you to be. Weapons against evil. But weapons can be turned, can be corrupted. The question is, what are you going to choose to be? Colonel Briggs had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. Enough of this superstitious nonsense. He barked. I don't care if their mother made a deal with the devil himself. They're still just two runaway slaves, and I have orders to bring them in. The old woman turned to look at him, and I saw something flicker across her face. Pity, maybe, or recognition. Colonel Marcus Briggs, born in Charleston, lost your wife and daughter to yellow fever 3 years ago. Been hunting runaway slaves ever since. Telling yourself it's about duty and law. Briggs went pale. How do you? But it's not about duty, is it? It's about pain. It's about needing someone to blame for all the hurt in your heart. These boys, they're just the latest target for your grief. Shut up, Briggs said, his voice shaking. You don't know anything about me. I know you dream about them every night. Your wife Sarah, your little girl Emma. I know you wake up screaming their names, wondering why God took them and left you behind. Mama Lavo's voice was gentle now, almost motherly. I know you think if you can just catch enough runaways, punish enough rebels, maybe the pain will stop. Tears were streaming down Briggs's face now, though his rifle remained steady. They were everything to me, everything. And they died while these animals live free. In the swamp. Your wife was named Sarah, I said suddenly, the connection hitting me like a physical blow. Just like the girl who died at Beaumont's plantation, the girl whose death started all this. Briggs's eyes widened with understanding and rage. You killed her. Sarah. No, Jonah said firmly. We watched her die, watched Beaumont and his son torture her to death for stealing food. We couldn't save her, but we've been carrying her memory ever since. Briggs screamed, raising his rifle. You're lying. But Mama Lavo stepped between us, her small frame somehow blocking the much larger man's line of fire. He's telling the truth, Marcus. Your grief has been used, twisted, turned into a weapon against the very people who might understand your pain. She reached into a small bag at her waist and pulled out something that made Briggs gasp. A locket tarnished with age, but still recognizable. You're Sarah's locket, she said softly. The one she was wearing when she died in that plantation house. I took it from her body before they buried her in an unmarked grave. The Briggs's rifle clattered to the bottom of his boat as he reached for the locket with shaking hands. How do you have this? Because I was their child. I've been watching over these boys since the night they fled, trying to understand what their mama's bargain really meant. And I was there when your Sarah died, holding her hand as she passed, promising to find someone who would remember her story. The colonel opened the locket and I could see a tiny portrait inside. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Nothing like the broken, tortured girl we'd seen in Beaumont's parlor. She was beautiful, I said quietly. And she was brave. Even at the end, she didn't break. Didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her spirit crushed. Briggs looked up at me with eyes full of anguish. You really saw her die. We saw it all. Jonah confirmed. And it's why we became what we are. Why we can't stop killing the men who do things like that to innocent people. The hunger your mama gave you, Mama, Lavo said, turning back to us. It's not evil in itself. It's a tool like a knife or a gun. Can be used to protect or to destroy depending on the hand that wields it. She gestured toward Briggs and his remaining soldiers. These men, they're not evil. They're just lost following orders from men who are. The real monsters are back in their comfortable houses, sending others to do their dirty work. Ash understood what she was offering us, a choice. We could continue down the path of violence, killing anyone who stood in our way until we became the monsters the stories claimed we were. Or we could try to be something else, something better. What do you want us to do? I asked. Want you to remember why you started this. Not for the pleasure of killing, but for justice. For Sarah and all the others like her. She looked at each of us in turn. The hunger will always be there, boys, but you can choose how to feed it. Briggs was still staring at the locket, tears streaming down his weathered face. I've been hunting the wrong people, whispered. All this time I've been hunting the wrong people. It's not too late, Mama Lavo said gently. Choose a different path. All of you can. The sun was setting over the Louisiana swamp, painting the water red and gold. In the distance, I could hear the sound of more boats approaching, reinforcements probably, or maybe just traders heading home for the night. Our story had reached a crossroads. Could continue being the swamp devils, the legendary killers who haunted the bayou. Or we could try to become something else. Protectors instead of predators, guardians instead of ghosts. I looked at Jonah, seeing my own thoughts reflected in his eyes. We'd killed 35 men in our quest for freedom and justice. The question now was whether that number would continue to grow or whether we could find a different way to honor the memory of those who died. Colonel, I said, extending my hand toward Briggs. Maybe it's time we stopped hunting each other and started hunting the real monsters. He stared at my outstretched hand for a long moment, the weight of his grief and rage wearing with something that might have been hope. The choice he made would determine not just our fate, but the fate of everyone who would hear our story in the years to come. The dawn came blood-red over the Louisiana swamp, and with it the sound of an army on the march. But this time, Jonah and I weren't running from the soldiers. We were leading them. 3 weeks had passed since Mama Lavo's revelation on the island. 3 weeks since Colonel Briggs had made his choice to join us instead of hunters. What followed was the strangest alliance in the history of the American South. 2 runaway slaves, a grief-stricken military officer, and a voodoo priestess united in a mission that would either free dozens of innocent people or get us all. "Movement ahead," whispered Sergeant Hayes, one of Briggs's men, who chosen to follow his colonel down this dangerous new path. "Looks like the patrol schedules you gave us were accurate." I nodded, checking my rifle one final time. The information had come from Samuel's network of escaped slaves and sympathizers, a detailed map of the Beaumont plantation security, guard rotations, and most importantly, the location of the punishment cells where Master Beaumont kept slaves who displeased him. "Remember," Briggs said, quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command, but tempered with something that hadn't been there before. "Compassion. We're not here for revenge. We're here for rescue." It was a fine distinction, but an important one. The old Elias and Jonah would have come here to kill Beaumont and his son, to make them pay for what they'd done to Sarah and countless others. But Mama Lavo's words had changed something in us, redirected the hunger towards something more constructive. We were still weapons, still carried that dark gift our mother had given us. But now we were pointed at the right targets. "Elias," Jonah Briggs continued, "you know this place better than any of us." Point. It felt strange, walking openly toward the plantation that had been our prison for 19 years. Strangers still to be doing it alongside white soldiers who just weeks ago had been trying to kill us. But Mama Lavo had been right about one thing. Sometimes the most unlikely alliances were the strongest. The plantation looked exactly as I remembered it and completely different at the same time. The white columns of the main house still gleamed in the morning light. The field still stretched out in neat rows toward the horizon. But now I could see it for what it really was. A monument to human suffering, built on the backs of people who'd never had a choice. There Jonah pointed toward a low building behind the main house. "That's where they keep the punishment cells. There are people to rescue, they'll be there." We moved through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, our footsteps silent on the familiar paths. Smell the place. Wood smoke, magnolia blossoms, and underneath it all the scent of fear and desperation that seemed to permeate every inch of the plantation. The first guard never saw us coming. He was dozing at his post, rifle propped against a fence post, completely unprepared for the silent figure that emerged from the shadows behind him. Jonah's hand covered his mouth while I pressed the point of my knife against his throat. "Make a sound and you die," I whispered. "Nod if you understand." The guard nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Good. Fear would keep him alive and cooperative. "How many prisoners in the cells?" Jonah asked. 6, the guard whispered when Jonah removed his hand. "Maybe 7. They brought in a family yesterday. Caught them trying to run north." "A family?" My jaw tightened with anger, but I forced myself to stay focused. Anger was useful, but only if it was controlled, directed. "Guards. 2 more inside the building. But they'll be asleep this time of morning." We tied him up and left him behind a woodshed, alive, but unable to raise an alarm. The old U.S. would have killed him without hesitation, but Mama Lavo's words echoed in my mind. The hunger will always be there, boys. But you can choose how to feed it. The punishment building was a low, windowless structure that looked more like a tomb than a place meant to hold living people. I could hear sounds from inside, quiet sobbing, the rattle of chains, someone praying in a voice from screaming. The two guards inside were indeed asleep, sprawled in chairs with empty whiskey bottles at their feet. Never woke up, but they didn't die either. Jonah and I had gotten very good at rendering people unconscious without killing them, though the temptation to do otherwise was always there. The cells were worse than I'd remembered. Tiny spaces barely large enough for a person to lie down, with iron bars that were rusted with blood and worse things. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Human waste, infection, despair made manifest. Jesus Christ. Sergeant Hayes breathed behind me. This is inhuman. This is slavery, I corrected grimly. This is what it really looks like when you strip away the pretty stories about happy gaining in the fields. The prisoners looked up at us with eyes that had given up hope long ago. A woman with a baby that couldn't have been more than a few months old. An old man whose back was a map of whip scars. Children who couldn't have been older than 10 huddled together for warmth and comfort. And in the last cell, barely recognizable under the bruises and dried blood, was someone I knew. Moses, I whispered, kneeling beside the bars. Moses, it's Elias. We're here to get you out. The old man who'd given us advice on the night we fled looked up at me with eyes that were clouded with pain, but still sharp with intelligence. Elias, boy, what are you doing here? You should be long gone, safe somewhere up north. Nope. We came back for you, Jonah said, already working on the lock with tools Briggs had provided for all of you. Moses struggled to sit up, wincing with pain. Boy, you know they got the whole county looking for you. There's a $1,000 bounty on your heads. We know, I said. We also know it doesn't matter anymore. We're not running anymore, Moses. We're fighting back. As we freed the prisoners, I could hear the sound of activity from the main house. Voices calling out the stamp of feet on wooden floors. Someone had discovered our presence. Time to go, Briggs said urgently. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they organize a proper response. But as we helped the freed slaves toward the Trian, a voice rang out across the plantation grounds that made my blood freeze. Elias, Jonah, I know you're out. Master Beaumont stood on the ver of the main house, still in his nightclothes but holding a rifle. Even at this distance, I could see the rage radiating from him like heat from a forge. You think you can come back here and steal my property? You think you can make a fool of me in my own home? Beside him, his son Charles appeared, also armed. The boy who'd helped torture Sarah to death, who'd smiled while she screamed. The hunger stirred in my chest, demanding satisfaction, demanding blood. Let me, I said to Briggs, my hand moving toward my rifle. No, the colonel's voice was firm. That's not why we're here. He killed Sarah, Jonah said, his own voice tight, with barely controlled rage. He killed her and God knows how many others. If we let him live, then we're no better than he is. Briggs finished. We came here to save people, not to become executioners. I wanted to argue, wanted to explain that some people deserve to die, that justice sometimes required blood. But as I looked at the freed slaves around us, the woman clutching her baby, the children holding hands as they stumbled toward freedom, I realized he was right. This was bigger than our personal need for revenge. This was about breaking the cycle, about choosing to be protectors instead of predators. You're right, I said finally, though every instinct screamed against it. Let's get these people to safety. We melted into the swamp as the plantation erupted behind us, Beaumont's voice echoing across the water as he screamed threats and promises of revenge. But his words couldn't reach us now. We were beyond his power, beyond his ability to hurt us or the people we'd sworn to protect. As the sun rose fully over the Louisiana bayou, painting the Spanish moss gold and green, thought about the journey that had brought us here. We'd started as scared boys fleeing in the night, become legendary killers, feared throughout the South, and finally transformed into something else entirely. Guardians of the innocent, protectors of the weak. The hunger was still there, would always be there. But now it served a purpose beyond simple violence. Now it was a tool for justice, a weapon against the darkness that men like Beaumont represented. Where to now? Moses asked as we reached the boats that would carry us deeper into the swamp toward communities of free people who would welcome these refugees. I looked at Jonah, at Briggs, at the faces of the people we'd saved. Wherever we're needed, I said, there are more plantations, more people who need help, and we've got work to do. The legend of the swamp devils was over. But the story of Elias and Jonah, the brothers who chose justice over vengeance, was just beginning. Behind us, the plantation burned, not from our torches, but from the fires that Beaumont's own slaves had set once they realized their master's power was broken. The old world was ending, consumed by the flames of its own cruelty. And from those ashes, something new was being born, something better, something free.